Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. I was listening to a really good live stream on KiwiBox's channel. Shout out to KiwiBox, make sure you check his channel out if you haven't done so already. And at KiwiBox, he was chatting with a regular contributor to his streams, a subscriber called Dan Mack. And they were talking about how people get into boxing, those moments that made you a fan, and the things that stuck with you as a fan. And Dan Mack, he said he'd like to hear from some of the other channels. Basically, he thought it would be nice to sort of get away from some of the negative news that tends to dominate. And I mean, you know the headlines, 70-80% of them that come out, it's generally a sort of negative sort of angle. And I guess that's just the nature of these sorts of videos and news in general, because if it bleeds, it leads. So I thought Dan Mack's sort of suggestion, other channels talk about some of this sort of thing, I thought that was a great idea. So that's what this video is about. And I'd be keen to hear in the comment section how or what got you hooked. Or maybe like me, your level of hardcoreness as a boxing fan has waxed and waned over the years. I'm sort of someone who's sort of dipped in and out of boxing in terms of how closely I've covered it. I've always followed it, but maybe not as closely at different points in my life. My first real awareness of boxing was in about 1987 or 88. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and you can probably guess where this is going. Mike Tyson. Quite a few of my extended family, they were into boxing to varying degrees. One uncle in particular was pretty avid in terms of his sort of fanboyness for Mike Tyson. And the way he'd talk about Tyson, it was almost like there was this sort of tone of reverence in his voice. And I started to catch Iron Mike's fights after this. And even in little old New Zealand, thousands of miles from America or the UK, Mike Tyson, he was a massive star. And these were the pre-internet days, remember? So achieving such a level of stardom in a country so far away from where he was fighting, it really was quite a thing. He was crossing continents, crossing oceans, and his star power, it really was quite incredible. And when Tyson fights rolled around, it was a big deal. A lot of people, they'd be seating themselves in front of TVs or at pubs, you know, bars, that sort of thing. And even though I was only about 8, I vividly remember when Tyson was upset by Buster Douglas. I mean, that shocked a lot of people. And of course, he went to jail about a year or so later, 1991, I think it was, and he was behind bars for a couple of years. But one of the fights that I do remember the most clearest in terms of Tyson was his clash in, I think it was November 1997. And the reason I remember it was it coincided with a TV station in New Zealand launching. And it was the first thing that new channel called Channel 4 was broadcasting. I mean, seriously, until then, if you didn't have pay TV, and even then it wasn't that sort of widespread, it was generally considered for rich people who had pay TV in New Zealand, regular TV was only 3 channels. And they were aptly named Channel 1, Channel 2, and Channel 3. So that event launched that channel, and man, it really was quite incredible. Because sometimes to catch these fights, you really had to, know someone who either had pay TV or, it really could be a bit of a stretch sometimes to see some of these fights live. Another moment that kept me interested in boxing early on was a New Zealand Olympic boxer, Trevor Shaler. He actually came to my school, and this was before the 1992 Barcelona Games. And I remember at that stage, from what he was saying, he had a record of about 112 to 5 losses. Well, it was something like that. It was really impressive. To a kid of about 10 years old, it sounded pretty impressive. But having an elite sports person come into the classroom, just talk about what it was like to be a top athlete and things of that nature, it was really quite inspiring. I mean, the fact that I still remember it so clearly, even, down to like the official New Zealand Olympic team tracksuit that him and some others who'd come along were wearing, it tells you that it did stick with me. And it's a reminder, I think, of how influential athletes can be. And I did follow Shaler at the Games, And I was disappointed for him that he wasn't able to go further than he did. And just earlier today, I looked it up, and he was 17th out of 30th in the 64 kg weight division at those games. But serendipitously, from keeping in touch with what was happening in the boxing at those 92 games, I got to catch some of the fights of this really exciting New Zealand heavyweight called David Tua. And he just kept advancing through the preliminaries and whatnot. And there was a real growing buzz that he might actually medal. And he did. And let me tell you, David Tua winning a bronze medal, it was a really big deal back in New Zealand. It wasn't really a sport that New Zealand generally got medals in. And Tua became an instant celebrity. And funny story, not long after the 92 games, New Zealanders probably know where the story's going. Tua appeared on a celebrity version of Wheel of Fortune, and he famously requested an O for awesome. Honestly, it was funny then, and it's probably even funnier now, actually. That moment of television gold, because that's what it was, it is literally still part of New Zealand's collective memory. And what I mean by that is, even now, people will use the O for awesome saying in certain situations. If you're from New Zealand, you'll know what I mean. And it's actually almost, I think, it's almost outgrown the man who said it. Younger people say it, and I know that they don't know the origin of it. There's also t-shirts as well. But from the 92 games, I was riding with Tua, and he turned pro pretty much immediately after. He was literally, over the next few years, a one-man wrecking crew. His profile and following in New Zealand at that time was huge. He was pretty much the only game in town. There were a few other sort of fighters on the scene, but nowhere near at the same level. There were guys like Jimmy Thunder who were quite popular, but David Tua, he was the 1990s in terms of boxing in New Zealand. Just like Joseph Parker is right now. He's dominated this decade. And Tua, he had some really good fights like Ruckman, Eisenreiter. These were some wars. And I remember feeling so deflated when he fought Lennox Lewis in 2000, because it was a huge, huge deal in New Zealand. And something Tua had worked so hard for since the 92 games. And he lost, and it was such a convincing loss. I mean, Lewis was just so good. A good big man, just work on the jab, and he just didn't let Tua catch up with him. Because Tua, he really wanted to... I mean, he was trying to box smart and look for the openings, but Lewis was being so defensively responsible. We know with Tua, and this is building to something here, another moment, sort of in the 2000s, he had some management issues. His weight, it would balloon between fights, some maybe lackluster performances, and in general, there was far less coverage of him after the title shot. But that changed. 2009. And this brings me to my next memorable boxing moment, when an aging Tua fought fellow New Zealander Shane the Mountain Warrior Cameron. And this was an eagerly anticipated domestic clash. Really, the hype for this fight, it was ridiculous. And Shane Cameron and his sort of promoter, the trash was incredible. It really was. And you can find this all over YouTube as well, because it really does sort of came back to bite them in the end. But that sort of hype, it was the forerunner to what we've seen with Joseph Parker in New Zealand. And there was also a huge amount of interest out of Australia for the fight, and also especially in the Pacific Islands. David Tua was very popular in the Pacific. So on fight night, I just happened to be in American Samoa, and I was on a journalism assignment. So in the few days before that fight, there had been an earthquake which had triggered a tsunami that had devastated Samoa, American Samoa, and Tonga. And this fight, it was broadcast live into the islands. So the people that I was watching the fight with, they were shocked when I told them that people in New Zealand thought that Shane Cameron was going to beat a supposed faded David Tua. It was honestly like it almost slapped them in the face. And I had to explain that Cameron, He'd been on this win streak, and he was quite a hype fighter, the sort of next big thing in New Zealand heavyweight boxing, sort of David Tua sort of heir apparent. And a lot of people considered that Tua was just, past it, that he was an over-the-hill former contender. So imagine this. I'm 3,000 kilometers from home, on an island in the middle of the Pacific that has just been battered by a tsunami. I'm sitting in a stranger's home, feverishly writing and filing stories related to the destruction and worse of that natural event. And meanwhile, everyone else in the room, they are just amped about the devastation. That's forgotten. They are just solely focused on this live broadcast, this Cameron Tua fight. And it was about to start. For me, I was thinking at the time, just the sort of situation I was in, I was just like, man, this is all just a bit crazy. And of course, when the bell rang, those who were in the room, they were ardent Tua fans, they erupted. And you can imagine when Tua brutally knocked Cameron out in the second round, the place just went into a frenzy, hugging, high fives, whooping, all that sort of stuff. So it was a bit of a weird situation to be in, given everything, or why I was there and everything that had been going on. But at least for that moment, those people got to forget about everything else that was going on, in maybe not directly in their lives, but certainly they knew people that had died, or knew people that had had homes destroyed, property destroyed, all that sort of thing. Over the years, I'd followed boxing to some degree or other, as I sort of alluded to earlier. But I did have a little bit of a lull sort of in the 2000s. For some years there, I was off studying, partying, building a career, all that sort of stuff. What you do. But even then, I would still read fights, reports in the newspaper, catch highlights on TV. But what really put me on the path to, being a hardcore boxing fan was and I was already following it reasonably closely, but not much more, than sort of as I've talked about. Because when you're a hardcore fan, you're searching out all the information you can on these fighters, opponents. You're learning about the rest of their division, who are you know what I'm talking about. And it was actually the sort of rise of Joseph Parker, who turned pro sort of back in 2012, that sort of put me onto that path. And if you aren't from New Zealand, you may not appreciate just how much buzz was around him, even from the beginning. It's kind of like, I can only compare it to a New Zealand version of how AJ was hyped in the UK, or Wilder in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It was one of those things where you could see this guy is going places. And more people, they were just jumping on board for the ride. He fought often, and he was entertaining. And that's everything fans want. They want to see a good performance, see someone get brutally knocked out. Because in those sort of early years, he definitely was considered a KO specialist. And that was why he had so much buzz around him, sort of his reputation started to precede him. And even though the undercards for his fights, they were generally trash, because let's admit it, they were. Duco events, they're Parker's promoters, they ran good events. And it would generally culminate with a Parker KO. So everyone sort of walked away happy. It's one of those things, though, where over time I migrated from, because I'd started to follow boxing more and more closely, learning about the heavyweight division and just boxing in general in terms of the other divisions. But I sort of migrated from boxing websites to YouTube, and that's sort of in the last couple of years. Following guys like Hatman Strikes Back, Kiwi Box, Mr. Boxing Today, Travis Gotti Boxing, Hitman Boxing, Boxing Wave, 78 Sports TV, Black Fight Fan TV, IFL TV, T Street Controversy, Barbershop Conversations, Beach Boxing, T Cozy Boxing. I'm sure there's some on that I haven't listed that I used to sort of watch quite often. But some of those, over time your preferences change, or you end up finding other channels because there's so many out there. I mean, more recently I've been watching a lot of guys like MBT Boxing, Delboy94, Boxing 24/7, Cheddar Boxing, Sporting Icons, Boxing Gossip, Boxing Librarian, Boxing Beats and Rhymes, Young Boxing, Adi Oladipo. I mean, there's literally so much choice. And for any given fight, no matter the division, you can find great content on YouTube. So I really do appreciate the fact that you come to my channel and you watch my videos. I'll give you my honest opinion, and you'll never die wondering about what I think about things. So I appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed, a little plug here, please subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you can. I'm often asked though, why do I only cover the heavyweight division? And the main reason is actually just time. I mean, while I follow other divisions, especially from 147 up to 168, because there's some great fights all across those divisions right through there, I made a conscious choice to only cover the heavyweights. Running a channel, working full time, it is certainly a juggling act. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into sort of producing a video. Probably just seems like a lot of people just jump on and do it, and some do. But I like to sort of have more preparation, have a bit more thought. The editing takes time, the uploading, all that sort of stuff. There's all these little details. But it is fun. I really enjoy it, and I hope you are enjoying the content. You might not always like everything that I say, but you'll always know where I stand. I'll leave things here, but I would say if you are a passionate boxing fan, you have been contemplating starting a channel, just make the leap. Do it. Take the plunge. I highly recommend it. And if you do, let me know and I will subscribe and follow your channel. But let me know, what got you into boxing? What were some of those moments that stuck with you? And for whatever reason. And often it's some of the reasons that you wouldn't think you'd remember something as memorable, but you do. Just like my example of why I remember one Mike Tyson fight so vividly was because there was a television channel launching with that as, so you can kind of see it doesn't always have to be because it was the best fight or the worst fight. It can be for some sort of esoteric reason. Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. Boxing_squared. I'm out.